In the 90s, Dream Theater were one of the most popular metal bands around. In an era where metal was being pushed to the wayside, their music managed to garner a cult following ever since the release of their sophomore classic, Images and Words, in 1992. This, as well as their next album, Awake, helped cement Dream Theater as one of the most important bands of the 90s. But they couldn't keep up that momentum forever. After their third album, Awake, had been a commercial disappointment for the label, they wanted to get more hands-on with the band, knowing everything that they were doing and not letting a single note be recorded before approval. This would not only result in an album that would have mixed reception from fans, but also nearly result in the implosion of Dream Theater. This is the story of Falling Into Infinity, the album that nearly broke Dream Theater. But first, let's start with some context. After the tour for Images and Words had been completed, the band returned to the studio to record their follow-up. However, before the mixing of the album began, keyboardist Kevin Moore announced that he would be leaving the band due to him not being interested in continuing the music that Dream Theater had been producing. This was a big shock to the band, and also a loss as Moore had been an original member and one of the main creative forces in the early era. The band would need to find a new keyboardist before they could even think for touring for Awake, so decided to quickly hold auditions to try and find a new keyboardist. In the running was Dio and Yngwie Malmsteen guitarist Jens Johansson, but also an up-and-coming keyboardist known as Jordan Rudess. The band wanted Rudess to be in the band, and even got him to play at a trial gig, which went well. However, Rudess decided to tour with the Dixie Dregs, due to the fact they had much less hardcore touring schedule. The band therefore opted to hire Kiss and Alice Cooper keyboardist Derek Sherinian to become a hired hand for the Awake tour, almost as a trial run for him before he became a proper member. The band not only liked his playing, but enjoyed his positive and easygoing personality, which helped them due to the turmoil that the band was going through at the time. This would not be the last of their issues, however, as James LaBrie would get food poisoning and would rupture his vocal cords, which he was told by doctors to take a rest and not sing. However, due to pressure to keep the band touring to not lose any popularity, the band would tour Japan and Europe, which went against the doctor's orders, and caused LaBrie to not only have even more vocal issues that would plague him for the next couple of years, but would send him into a deep depression, and he thought about leaving the band as he felt like he was dragging them down, but the band urged him to stay. Overall, the Awake album and tour have been very turbulent for the band, and on returning to the studio, their issues would only get worse. With Derek Sherinian now an official member of the band, they decided to test the waters with him to not only see how he does working with the band, but also how fans would receive him as a new member. To do this, they decided to go back to a song that had originally been left off of Images and Words called A Change of Seasons. While it had not been put on the album at the time due to it being too long to record for the album, the band had decided to continue to play it live. It had become a legendary song in their cult fanbase, with a lot of die-hard fans wanting them to record an official version of the song, and the band saw this as a perfect way to test out how Sherinian would work in the band. The song would be extended from the original 17 minutes to about 23 minutes, with Sherinian contributing a whole new intro and keyboard solo to the song. It has gone down as one of the most treasured songs by the band's fanbase, and you can tell the mark Sherinian is already leaving on the band. It's a great song that would have been cool to have on Images and Words, but I'm actually glad they left it until now to properly record it, as Sherinian's work on it was excellent. The band would release this on the Change of Seasons EP released in 1995, along with a handful of cover songs they had recorded at a concert at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club. Despite the fact it's labelled as an EP, it's actually 57 minutes long, but Portnoy said, "It was important for us and the label for it not to be perceived as the latest studio record. That's why we tagged it as an EP." After a short tour for the EP and a small break for the members, the band returned to the studio to record what would become their most divisive album yet. Upon returning to the studio, the band found that a lot of the staff at their label, East West, who was there when the band got signed, had left, including their main contacts within the label. Up until now, Dream Theater had basically been allowed to do whatever they wanted with their music, which caused their music to be as progressive as they wanted. However, due to Awake not being as successful as Images and Words, with no breakout single like Pull Me Under, the label urged the band to write more commercial songs to try and get hits that would end on the radio. The band practically refused to do this, but the label didn't let them start recording without them seeing all the songs. This caused a stalemate, as the band would continue to write songs for almost a year, but would not be allowed to record them due to the fact the label didn't like them. This also led to Portnoy to become so frustrated with this, he nearly left the band during this time, to the fact that his life's work was being held back by a label. During this time, the band would continue to play live shows to try and get their energy out, as well as to try out some of the new songs live, where they would play the longer versions that had been rejected by the label. This was where Sherinian had started to come out of his shell a lot more, revealing himself as the more outgoing and flamboyant character, which was very different to the more conservative look he had while he was a touring musician. He is practically what kept the band together during this time, as his optimism and outgoing personality meant the band were able to be in high spirits even when they were stressed out with the label interference. Even when the band were given the go-ahead to record, they still were met with setbacks from the label. They had enough music to make the album a double CD, but the label refused to fund a double album, telling the band they would have to cut the songs down to make it fit a single 80-minute disc. This caused the band to cut multiple songs that had been written, including the song Metropolis Part 2, a sequel to the first part from Images and Words, which had become legendary by the band's fanbase. This would later be expanded from a song to a whole album, showing how much the band wanted to release it. The songs that didn't make the album would later be released on the Cleaning Out the Closet CD in 1999 as part of their fan club. The band teamed up with producer Kevin Shirley, who was most known at that point for working with Rush on their comeback album Counterparts, which had done pretty well. He was also pretty hands-on with the production, quite like the label, and altered a lot of what was left on the album. He would split the instrumental section at the end of Burning My Soul, turning it into the individual song Hell's Kitchen. He also recommended the band work with songwriter Desmond Child, who was known for helping write hits for bands like Alice Cooper, Bon Jovi, and Aerosmith, who Shirley was also producing for around this time. John Petrucci would accept this offer, and Child would help write the song You Not Me on the album. It clearly has more of a pop edge to it, and might be the most accessible Dream Theater song they had written up to this point. This, at least in my opinion, stresses the main theme that's going to overtake this album. Not just the fact that the label was getting involved, but how the members of the band reacted to the ask to write more radio-friendly songs. While Portnoy adamantly fought back against this, wanting to keep writing the more progressive and heavy songs they had been doing up to that point, Petrucci was much more open to the idea, and you can tell from his songs on the album, with his being the lighter and more catchy songs compared to Portnoy, who mostly continued to write the heavier and more complex songs the band had been known for up to that point. Compared to the songwriting and pre-production, the band found the actual recording of the album to be pretty fun and nowhere near as stressful, and on September 23rd, 1997, the band would release their fourth album, Falling Into Infinity. The album kicks off with the song New Millennium, and it kicks off in a very good way. Penned by Mike Portnoy, which is evident by the fact this song is basically classic Dream Theater. Sherinian's keyboard sound is really good here, and complements the rest of the members great, especially pairing particularly well with Petrucci's guitars. It has a really good speed to it, and both Myung and Portnoy are doing some really cool things in the rhythm section. James LaBrie still sounds great on here despite his vocal issues, which really show just how great his vocals are on pretty much everything he does. This song doesn't sound like a band being held by the shackles of a label, and is one of the only songs on this album that I can say could have ended up on one of their previous albums. But it also continues to highlight the divisions in the band for this album. This is because, compared to this, a lot of Petrucci songs have a more commercial and radio-friendly sound to them. There's the aforementioned You Not Me, which was penned by Desmond Child. While I do like the song, it is very commercial, and the same can be said about the song Take Away My Pain. Both songs are big choruses that you could see easily being played on 90s rock radio, and don't really sound like anything the band had done before. Unlike their previous ballads like Another Day, these songs don't sound much like Dream Theater, having none of their uniqueness to them. However, the biggest offender of this is the only single from this album, Hollow Years. While both of the other songs do have elements such as the drumming or the solos that give the songs a bit of Dream Theater magic, the same unfortunately can't be said about Hollow Years. Apart from LaBrie's voice, there's really nothing separating this from a lot of the alt rock that was going on around this time, at least in my opinion. I don't hate this song or anything, it's better than basically anything on The Astonishing, but in my opinion, it sounds kinda generic, and for a band as boundary pushing as Dream Theater, that is something in my opinion they should never be. This sounds very much like the label pushing the band to write commercial songs, and didn't do very well on the charts. These songs have been received pretty negatively by Dream Theater fans and haven't been played much live, with You Not Me only being played live 3 times, and Hollow Years not being played in nearly 15 years. In my opinion, it really was a bad idea to lead off the album with this song, because it led to a lot of classic Dream Theater fans to come into this album with a pretty negative opinion from the start, while new listeners wouldn't have seen them as anything unique from a lot of the 90s alt rock, causing them to get lost in the shuffle. In comparison, Portnoy songs are a lot more like what fans would expect from a Dream Theater album. He kept up the heaviness the band had been expanding on with Awake, and this was aided by the heavier keyboard tone of Sherinian. A lot of his lyrics came out of the frustration of being told what to do by the label, which Portnoy was fighting back against during the entire making of this album. He has said that this was a very stressful time for him, and on songs like Just Let Me Breathe, you can tell how he's feeling deep down. Overall, I far prefer the Portnoy pen tracks on this album, as I feel like he had a lot more drive and anger into his songs, which comes across in the music being complex and aggressive. The aforementioned New Millennium is killer, and I also love Burning My Soul. Despite only writing 3 songs for the album, which is low as Portnoy would go on to write a lot more, especially in the 2000s, I think his stuff is by far the best on this album, and it contrasts a lot with the songs written by Petrucci. You can audibly hear who wrote each of the songs on this album due to the 2 completely different plans for what they wanted to do, and it makes for a very unique and interesting listen. However, it would be Petrucci who would write my favourite song on this album, which is Peruvian Skies. It's very different for Dream Theater, and until the end isn't very heavy and is almost a ballad, but it's one of the band's most beautiful songs. It talks about child abuse and paints an amazing picture of what's happening, with so much atmosphere going into each part of this song. I love how it starts slow and wispy before building into the big and bombastic climax that ends the song. I feel like this is a very unique song, not just on this album but in the band's entire catalogue, as I feel they haven't really done another song quite like this before or after, and that's a shame. If Petrucci wanted to write more ballads, I wish he'd written them in the style of this song, as it's one of my favourites the band has ever done. The keyboards add a great danger to the end as the song gets heavier and heavier, which contrasts with the beautiful beginning, and really shows that this song would not be the same without Sherinian. If you haven't given this song a listen or not heard it in a while, I would highly recommend going back to it. It's one of the band's best, and I wish they would bring it back on a tour. Both Myung and LaBrie would both pen 1 song for the album. LaBrie's was another song about child abuse called Anna Lee, and it's alright. Out of all the ballads, it's one of my favourites on here, as it has an emotional crux that a lot of the other ballads are missing, but it's still not one of my favourites on the album. Myung would write the closing epic for the album, Trial of Tears, and it's one of my favourites on the album. It starts slow, but doesn't lose any of the heaviness that a Dream Theater song should have, and it gives Sherinian a lot of time to show why he's a great fit for the band. The whole song shows off how Sherinian and Petrucci really worked well together, and in fact I think they complemented each other a lot better than Petrucci would with Rudess after this. but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. The guitar solo on this song is great, and I love that the band gets to do a bit of an instrumental jam session, and it's great and really shows the chemistry this lineup of the band would have. Myung has said the song deals with egos, which was therapeutic for him, and could possibly have come from the divisions in the band at the time, as there was quite a bit of ego going on at the band. The song builds in the way the best Dream Theater songs do, and it closes off a great song for a great and severely underrated album. Overall, I do think that this album is better than a lot of the reactions it got at the time of its release. It didn't receive the critical acclaim that both the albums before it got, and a lot of the fans complained that the band had almost sold out. However, it's seen quite a resurgence in the last 5 years or so, and while it isn't seen as being as good as the other albums of the 90s that this band put out, people have started to see that it's a great album that it was. Probably the biggest shame was that this album didn't really get much commercial success, and in fact sold even worse than Awake did, meaning all the ideas from the record companies to try and make the sound more commercial to draw in casual listeners practically all went to waste. Mike Portnoy has gone on to say that if there wasn't much pressure from the record company and Kevin Shirley to make a more commercial album, then the album would have sounded nothing like it does. In comparison, Petrucci said that this was the album he wanted to make and there wasn't much interference from the label, as Portnoy says, but considering the fact that his songs sound like radio fodder, I find that pretty hard to believe. The band would set out on the Touring to Infinity World Tour, where they would record the live album and DVD once in a lifetime. However, this would be the last of their recorded work with Derek Sherinian as an official member of the band. Both Portnoy and Petrucci had formed a supergroup Liquid Tension experiment in 1997, with King Crimson bassist Tony Levin and Jordan Rudess, who the band had wanted to join them after Moore left. The band were left with a choice, as Rudess now did not have touring commitments with the Dixie Dregs, whether to let Sherinian go and bring Rudess on. Petrucci and Portnoy convinced Labrie and Myung to have Jordan Rudess join, and to let Sherinian go. This was especially hard for Myung, as he was in a side project with Sherinian called Platypus that would continue after Sherinian left. The band fired Sherinian over a conference call so that they could replace him with Rudess in January 1999. This was, to put it lightly, a massive dick move from the band, as Sherinian had not only been in the band and played on their latest album, but also brought the band together when they were nearly splitting up. To be honest, I would go as far as to say I think Sherinian worked better for the band than Rudess ever would, and I really wish he'd stayed on for a bit longer. He would join the band for a one-off concert in 2004, and has said that since his departure, where he was left angry and hated the band, he has been on good terms with them. And with that, the most turbulent and difficult era for the band would come to a close. After the release of their next album, Metropolis Part 2, the band would be shot into the most success they ever had, and were allowed to have much more creative freedom with the albums they wanted. While this era was filled with turbulence, I think that the music that came out of it was some of the band's best. Despite its glaring flaws, I think Falling Into Infinity is still a great album, and there's some of the band's best songs on it, and The Change of Seasons is also a great release. If you haven't listened to this album in a while, I'd highly recommend returning to it, as I feel it's aged very well and is almost better now than it was back in the 90s. While I'm still not a fan of a lot of the songs that were obviously meant for radio, I think songs like Peruvian Skies and Trial of Tears are severely underrated. But what do you think? Do you like this era of the band? Or do you fall into the camp that think this was a big misstep for the band, and thought they found their way again when they got Rudess back on keyboards? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and follow my Album of the Year page for my latest reviews. Check out my other videos and let me know what you think. But as always, stay safe, stay happy, and stay metal.